Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Situated on Victoria Embankment, just a short walk away from the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Bridge, is New Scotland Yard, the headquarters of London's Metropolitan Police. Scotland Yard is a term that's been synonymous with policing and detective work for almost 200 years. An association that's been cemented not only through the Yard's involvement with a host of notorious real-life crimes, but also through countless references to it in literature and popular culture. In Charles Dickens's Bleak House, for example, which was published between 1852 and 1853, we meet Inspector Bucket, arguably the first depiction in fiction of what we'd now recognise as a modern detective, who was inspired by a real Scotland Yard detective named Charles Frederick Field. Likewise, in 1868, Dickens's friend, Wilkie Collins, published The Moonstone, an early detective novel which featured the worldly wise Sergeant Richard Cuff, who was also based at Scotland Yard. Sherlock Holmes was often consulted by the Yard, and in Jules Verne's 1872 novel Around the World in 80 Days, Inspector Fix is dispatched from Scotland Yard to pursue Phileas Fogg across the globe, after the adventurer is mistaken for a bank robber. In 1929, Alfred Hitchcock's Blackmail, the first feature-length talking film to be produced in Britain, centred on Scotland Yard detective Frank Webber. And in the Belgian cartoonist Hergé's Tintin books, the bumbling detectives Thompson and Thompson, who first appeared in 1934, famously exclaim, "Great Scotland Yard," whenever they're startled. Although Scotland Yard is now a household name, it is, when you think about it, a rather unusual title for a police headquarters that's based in London. So where did the term come from? Well, to find the answer, we'll need to take a short walk from here to the original Great Scotland Yard, a surprisingly unassuming street close to Trafalgar Square, which connects Whitehall to Northumberland Avenue. It's widely believed that Great Scotland Yard does indeed have a direct connection with the history of Scotland itself. The earliest reference to the patch of land that would become Scotland Yard can be traced all the way back to 1436, when 12 jurors of Westminster stated that a piece of land between Charing Cross and Westminster had, quote, been given by a former King of England to a former King of Scotland, in order that the latter might build a house there in which to lodge when attending Parliament. But that owing to the hostilities between the two kings, the land had not been built on. Over 100 years later, in 1548, a man named Nicholas Bodrugan expanded on this claim in a pamphlet, the rather catchily titled An Epitome of the Title that the King's Majesty of England hath to the Sovereignty of Scotland, in which he said the English monarch in question was King Edgar, and that the Scottish king was Kenneth II. If true, this would date the historic land deal to the late 10th century. Bodrugan also claimed that King Kenneth II had built a house on the plot, and although the building had since fallen into ruin, the ground where it stood is called Scotland to this day. Perhaps the best early evidence of an official Scottish presence here came 40 years later in John Stow's Survey of London, an early guide to the city which was first published in 1598. In it, Stow tells us that, close to Charing Cross, is, quote, a large plot of ground enclosed with brick, and it is called Scotland, where a great building hath been for receipt of the kings of Scotland and other estates of that country. John Stow's account would certainly make sense, as in those days, Scotland Yard and the great building which he mentions were located at the northern end of the former Palace of Whitehall, a vast royal residence which stretched from present-day Trafalgar Square all the way down to Parliament Square. Being a major seat of power, many dignitaries and noblemen were keen to be as close to the palace as possible, and the Scotland Yard building, which John Stow describes, would have been most likely a diplomatic establishment, an early embassy if you will. Indeed, Margaret Tudor, who was Queen of Scotland between 1503 and 1513, spent time in residence here. As we can see on this map, dating from 1680, the patch originally known as Scotland Yard was pretty big. So much so that on other maps, it was sometimes divided into 3 yards: Greater, Middle and Inner. There was also a wharf on the Thames that was sometimes referred to as Scotland Dock. Being so close to the heart of government, many civil servants made Scotland Yard their home, and several famous figures spent time living here, most notably the architects Inigo Jones and Sir Christopher Wren, and the poet John Milton, who's best known for his epic work Paradise Lost. Scotland Yard is also name-checked in Jonathan Swift's first major work, 1704's Tale of a Tub, and for many years, part of the yard formed the garden for the Duke of Northumberland's mansion, after which of course Northumberland Avenue is named. In the 17th century, numerous other buildings began to pop up around here, including a granary and bakehouse, a cider house, and a guardhouse, complete with sleeping quarters for soldiers. Although the Palace of Whitehall was destroyed by an almighty blaze in 1698, the area known as Scotland Yard remained, eventually morphing into the street we see today. Its first association with law and order came in 1812, when it was decided to relocate the Southwark-based Marshalsea Courthouse to Great Scotland Yard. The Marshalsea Courthouse dealt with relatively mundane issues, such as trespass and the regulation of street markets, although it was of course also associated with the dreaded Marshalsea debtors' prison. Until the early 19th century, the enforcement of law and order in London was piecemeal and poorly organised, relying on a ragtag bunch of night watchmen and thief-takers, essentially bounty hunters who were privately hired and open to all manner of corruption. The Bow Street Runners, London's first true police force, had been established in 1749, although they were a relatively small outfit, who operated out of Bow Street in Covent Garden. As the Industrial Revolution gained momentum and London's population soared to record levels, it was decided that a new, radical approach to law enforcement was urgently required, and so, in 1829, Sir Robert Peel established the Metropolitan Police Force, his name being the origin of the term Bobby. This new police force required a large address to operate from, and the site chosen for their base was number 4 Whitehall Place. And as for Great Scotland Yard? Well, the police headquarters backed onto that street, and it was here that an entrance and office area for the public were located. Therefore, as this was the public's main point of contact with the Met, most Londoners took to calling the HQ Scotland Yard, and the name stuck. Over the following few decades, the Metropolitan Police headquarters grew considerably, swallowing up more and more properties along the street. As part of this expansion, in the 1870s, they purchased a plot of land which had been intended as the terminus for an early underground line, the Feld, Waterloo and Whitehall Railway, which was intended to provide a shuttle service between Whitehall and Waterloo Station. And so, instead of an underground station, stables for police horses were erected here instead. Today the land is home to the Corinthia Hotel. If you wish to learn more about the Waterloo and Whitehall Railway, then please do stay tuned to the channel, as I'll be detailing its story in my next video. Speaking of horses, by the way, the Metropolitan Police still maintain a large stable complex for their mounted branch on Great Scotland Yard. Other buildings of note on Great Scotland Yard include the Civil Service Club and the Army's old Central London Recruiting Office, where in August 1914, thousands of men flocked to sign up following the outbreak of World War I. Today, that building is the Great Scotland Yard Hotel. An early version of the Public Carriage Office, the body responsible for regulating London's hackney carriages, which used to be managed by the Metropolitan Police, once stood in the middle of the road here, and in recent years, the street has appeared in numerous films, most notably as an entrance to the Ministry of Magic in the Harry Potter films. Although you won't find this red telephone box here, I'm afraid. That was a prop. One particularly intriguing innovation, which has been present in every incarnation of the Scotland Yard Police Headquarters, is the so-called Black Museum, an idea that was first conjured up in 1874 by an inspector named Percy George Neame. The small museum contains all manner of artefacts related to infamous crimes, everything from early death masks of executed felons, to Ruth Ellis's gun, and seemingly innocent household items owned by the serial killer Dennis Nilsen. This museum is primarily intended as a training facility, and as such is strictly off limits to the general public. Although a few years ago, a select number of objects were permitted to be displayed at a fascinating special exhibition held at the Museum of London. Although the Whitehall Place offices expanded throughout the 19th century, there still wasn't enough room to accommodate the ever-growing force. And so, in the late 1880s, it was decided to build a new, larger facility just around the corner on Victoria Embankment. This new HQ, which came to be known as New Scotland Yard, was comprised of two buildings, one of which is currently covered for renovations, forged from red brick and cream porcelain stone, quarried by inmates held at Dartmoor Prison no less, and was designed by Richard Norman Shaw, who, rather fittingly, had been born in Edinburgh. You can see a similar Shaw design in Liverpool, that's being Albion House, which once served as the headquarters for the White Star Line, the company who of course owned the doomed Titanic. Today, the two blocks which formed the second incarnation of Scotland Yard are collectively known as the Norman Shaw Buildings, and they now provide office space for politicians, complete with a direct connection to the neighbouring office building known as Portcullis House. Ironically, and I'll warn you now, gruesomely, a major crime scene was discovered at this site when New Scotland Yard was being constructed. The incident in question occurred in October 1888, when a worker discovered a large, paper-wrapped package tucked away in a recently constructed vault. The parcel was found to contain a female torso, which was matched to an arm that had been found in the Thames at Pimlico the previous month. A severed leg was also unearthed at the New Scotland Yard site after a sniffer dog was brought in. No other body parts, including the head, were ever discovered, and neither the victim nor the killer were ever identified. It's interesting to note that this mystery occurred in the autumn of 1888, the exact same time frame in which the Jack the Ripper spree was underway in Whitechapel, although detectives ruled out any connection. The Metropolitan Police remained at their second home until 1967, after which they moved to a shiny and very modern looking block on the corner of Broadway and Victoria Streets. It was here that the famous, slowly rotating New Scotland Yard sign made its debut. This third incarnation remained in use until 2014, when the complex was sold off for the handsome sum of £370 million. The site has now been redeveloped and is known as Orchard Place. New Scotland Yard then returned to Victoria Embankment, next door to its earlier offices, where it remains today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of Great Scotland Yard, and would love to hear your own thoughts on this historic street. Have you ever taken a stroll along it? What other films and TV shows can you think of that were filmed there? And which case dealt with by the Metropolitan Police fascinates you the most? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus, of course, it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.